All right, good afternoon. It's November 8th, 2023, about 2:05 p.m. Here for our monthly towing task force meeting. We'll go ahead and start with the roll call. Let's go ahead and start with John Connolly.
I'm here.
Thank you. Captain Hahn. Doesn't look like he's here yet. Jim Howes.
Here.
Thank you. Michael Pierce, he actually just emailed that he was going to be running a little late, so he may pop in a little bit later. So he's not present yet. Greg Prunsky, I do not see him yet. Brandon Rich.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Reister.
Here.
Thank you. Nathan Riley, that's myself, I am present. And finally, Joanne Rusha. Do not see her yet. Okay. So we don't quite have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and skip the next agenda item, that being the approval of the September 13th and October 11th meeting minutes. Those have been circulated, so if we get a few more members in here, we may be able to approve those, but we'll wait and see what happens. A few administrative items that I want to touch on real quick. First off, our Attorney General, who is typically here, John Roberts, indicated to me last week he was not going to be present today. So we'll still proceed without him. He just indicated if there's any more legal type questions that arise during our discussion, we would have to make note of those and address them with him later on, either sometime between now and the next meeting or potentially at the next meeting. So just FYI on that. Another thing, most of you should have received an email from our department on a new OIT cybersecurity training. I believe the email for that went out, unfortunately, the day after our last meeting on October 11th, so it would have been October 12th. We actually just learned about it along with all of you that was going to happen. Otherwise, we would have mentioned it at the last meeting. But yeah, it's a standard about 30-minute online training. It's pretty easy to sign up for, pretty easy to take. I myself have already done it. It is pretty simple, and it kind of mirrors what I'm required to do for our own department anyway. So it's pretty straightforward and shouldn't be too difficult to complete. The due date, I believe, for that is November 15th, which is a week from today. So if you haven't received that email, or maybe you lost it, either let myself or Hadija know, and we'll make sure you get another email for that, just to make sure you have everything you need to complete that. Otherwise, if you could please get that done within the next week, we'd really appreciate that. It's similar to the affidavits we have to fill out for our annual training, so it's kind of in that same vein. So yeah, if you could please get that done, we'd really appreciate it. Moving on to recruitment, I'm sure you're all aware we do have several vacant positions, so we are working with the governor's office to get those additional positions filled. All of our vacancies are governor appointed positions, so we are currently kind of in the recruiting phase for that. If you have any ideas for basically, anyone who you think might be good to fill any of our vacant roles, which at present we have the member who represents common interest communities, like HOAs and things like that. Or we have two vacancies for the members who represent communities that may be disproportionately affected by non-consensual towing. Our vacancy for someone to represent non-consensual towers, and then finally, our position that represents a motor carrier association that are consumers of towing services. So those are our 4 vacancy spots, total of 5 overall positions. If you have anybody that you can think of that may be interested in filling one of those roles, they're going to have to, just like all of you, go to the governor's website, specifically the boards and commissions. Sorry, I'm trying to get the link here for everybody. So basically, you go on and fill in an online application, essentially, and then you can essentially apply to be on the towing task force and any other boards and commissions that the governor's office oversees. Sorry, I'm trying to get that link. I'm having a little trouble finding it. Here it is. I think this is it. Yeah, here we go. So let me go ahead and I'm just going to link it in the chat here. Just if you want, anyone who's interested or anyone you think might be interested to fill one of those specific spots that are vacant, they can go to that link there and fill out an application, and the governor's office receives it. They loop us in on it, and then it just becomes part of the overall recruitment. So if you can think of anybody, please encourage them to apply, and they will be considered. And then finally, myself, Hadija, and John Roberts have been trying to put together some kind of rudimentary bylaws for the towing task force. It's something we just didn't get around to doing last year after all the positions were appointed. But it just kind of outlines exactly how the meeting process works and how motions work and all that. It's pretty much what we've been doing anyway, but it just kind of outlines it in a format that it makes it a little more easier for people to understand and follow. So we won't get into that today since John Roberts isn't here, but you know, we may address that in an upcoming meeting and vote on putting those in place. And I think that's all the administrative updates I have. So we can go ahead and move into our first discussion agenda item, which is something we've kind of spoken about a little bit, you know, last year and a little bit this year as well, which is the alternatives to the CPI for the annual inflation adjustment mechanism for towing carrier rates. We've kind of batted that around a little bit, and I know we had some items that we even recommended as part of our report last year. Let me pull those up real quick and we'll see what they were. Some of them I think were like offshoots to the CPI, but hold on a second, I'll let you know. Just a second, I was just pulling up a copy of our report last year. Okay, so some of these suggestions that we made, at least cursory suggestions we made, were the personal consumption expenditures, the PCE, the producer price index, PPI, and the CPI-transportation, CPIT, as potential alternatives to what the commission currently uses. What the commission currently uses is just essentially the flat CDOLA CPI. And let me pull that up real quick. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so the way that it currently works, let me zoom in a little bit. Yeah. So the way it currently works, or the way the commission currently does it, is they will essentially use the flat CDOLA, so that's the Colorado Division of Local Government, their inflation CPI metric. So it's for Denver, Aurora, and Lakewood, so the Denver Metro essentially. So when you click on that, it just takes you to essentially a flat percentage. So this is essentially the percentage that will get compounded into the towing rates on an annual basis. So the last one we did was back in March of this year, and it will occur again in March of 2024. So you can kind of see the last handful of rates, which I believe tie to the federal standard as well. At least that's my understanding, having spoken to somebody over at CDOLA sometime within the last year. So again, it's more of a flat rate that captures everything, which I think is why we were interested in maybe exploring potential alternatives that were a little more geared towards towing, or at least transportation in general, that we could pull off of, which figures may be different than these ones here. So definitely interested in continuing that conversation. Moving on, we can also look at these other ones we referenced, which was the personal consumption expenditures price index. Okay, so it looks like that is the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Okay, so it looks like they track it monthly, it appears. So it says a measure of the prices that people living in the United States or those buying on their behalf pay for goods and services. I don't know if this is broken out in other ways. Does anybody else know anything about this metric? It's the first time I'm seeing it. Let's see. Okay. So it looks like it breaks it out by certain things. So we see gasoline here. Let's see. Transportation services. There we go. I mean, it looks interesting. Something we could consider. I mean, it at least in this case, it does kind of break it out by different things. Maybe
it looks like it has motor vehicle up towards the top.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Motor vehicle and parts.
I'm just wondering if maybe if this is a route we wanted to go down with a potential recommendation that the commission shift from the basic CPI to something like this, you know, how we would recommend it, if it would be just like one of these metrics, or maybe we combine multiple of them into one. I don't know how that would work.
Yeah, I'd say you'd go through and combine all those that pertain.
Right. Sure. Well, I mean, it's, I mean, depending on the kind of towing carrier we're talking about, it could be more than, well, this is more just goods and services, but it wouldn't factor in things like, you know, property taxes and things like that either.
Right.
So we'd have to take that into consideration. Insurance, though, is here. Yeah. Financial services and insurance. I'm just wondering if this. Yeah, go ahead, John.
So real quick, it was a thought that we were leaving the towing rates the same and then just changing the inflation adjuster, or were we looking at the towing rates as well?
Well, I think we can look at that too. It's just, you know, this was kind of an again, since it's something new that the commission's trying, I don't think it hurts for the towing task force to take a position on the fact that this is now the new metric that the commission is using to annually adjust the towing rates. So, I mean, yeah, we can always address the towing rates themselves, sure. But also the fact that, you know, again, it's kind of more of a new concept that the commission is trying. I don't know that they've really been in the habit over the years of implementing these kinds of policies where there's essentially a trigger over the course of the year to adjust maximum rates. That's kind of a new concept that's only come up over these last, you know, 2-3 years. And so I guess just kind of trying to, if it's something the towing task force is comfortable with the commission doing, then that's fine. And that can be a position the towing task force takes. But also, you know, even if that is the position of the task force, what potentially, you know, can it be refined from what it is now? Because right now, like I said, what we're doing is essentially just taking this flat CDOLA percentage, which takes, I think, everything into consideration, not just, you know, certain metrics. It's kind of an overall catch-all inflation percentage, and potentially do something that's a little more specific to the towing industry, or at least the transportation industry in general. Does that answer your question, Brandon?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have any other comments, John?
Oh, no, I was just looking at it.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. Let me tell you what. Let me going to go ahead and include the link to this in the chat as well. So if anybody wants to, go in there and poke around a little more, like I said, what we were just in is the interactive data right here. So if anybody wants to go in there and poke around a little bit, I think that's could be helpful. Let's see. The other one we were looking at is the producer price index. There we go. Okay, so that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So it says it measures the average change over time in the selling prices received by domestic producers for their output. Prices included in the PPI are from the first commercial transaction for many products and some services. Let's see. Okay, so we got things on here like, and it looks like you can kind of mix and match. So like transportation and warehousing. It's more general kind of in the transportation area, it seems like. Okay. I mean, again, it's more specific than just the general CPI we've been using. I don't know. It's hard to tell if it would be better or not. It kind of looked like the PCE was a little better than this one. Okay, and then the third one was CPI transportation. Okay, so they have something in the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. Okay, so it talks about fuel costs, airfare. So yeah, we'd have to be a little careful when we're talking about just transportation in general, because I didn't even think that it could include airfare, which is not really related. Okay, so here's some figures. Okay, so we got private transportation, fuel, new vehicles, parts and equipment, maintenance, insurance. Well, this first part looks pretty good, but then we get into public transportation, and it looks like most of this stuff probably wouldn't apply. But some of these other things may work. So if we were to take, for example, 2020 to 2022, you can see the adjustment here for different parts of it. Yeah, it's hard to say. What the best way to do it is. Well, here's this. Let's do this. Go ahead and put this in the chat as well. Well, yeah, I think those two are the best, the personal consumption expenditures and CPI transportation. But yeah, we'd have to sort through it and figure out exactly how the figures in there would work. Because again, even here with these, not everything on this list is, I mean, you got the overall percentage up here at 32.3%, but that factors in every piece of this, which is some of it's not going to apply. So it's almost like we'd have to pick and choose or make a suggestion on what to pick and choose off of this list to kind of, I don't know, average them together or what. Okay. Well, so those are, some things we can continue to think about. Because I do think the commission would be receptive to it. If we could come up with some kind of a potentially better alternative to just the flat CDOLA CPI, which admittedly is good because it's more specific to our area. So that's one of the reasons that could be considered a good metric to use as opposed to some of these more federal level ones. But like I said, I think the commission would be receptive to if there was an alternative metric that potentially could be a little more suited and a better metric to use when considering these annual inflation adjustments. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this?
I mean, that's kind of on the CPI that we currently use. The only thing it doesn't grasp is like the price of equipment and things like that. So, I mean, if we could dial something in that actually hit every little avenue, and that'd be interesting if we could figure out something that kind of covered those.
Yeah.
Right now, it's just a shot in the dark on a general idea.
So my understanding is the CDOLA CPI kind of is not much more than a mirror image of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS figures. I'm not sure if we can somehow backtrack through it, because I don't think there's anything on the CDOLA website where we can kind of pick and choose. Like it looks like we maybe can with some of these more federal level things.
Right.
But I mean, if we backtrack through to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's what I'm looking at now. I don't know if there's a way to, because I'm not seeing it really be broken up into like different categories, which would be the most helpful.
Well, that's going through it and picking each category, then adding that all together and then find out how close the CPI is. That's probably pretty par.
Okay, yeah, it may not make much of a difference, and maybe that is the case, but okay. And I mean, I don't know how much research the commission did when implementing or deciding just to use the CDOLA CPI. I mean, obviously a local tool is perceived better, at least. But like I said, that's why I think the commission would be receptive to an alternative if we could just simply demonstrate what a viable alternative is.
Right.
Hey, Michael. We were just going over our agenda item on CPI alternatives. So we've taken a look at some of the ones we suggested looking into in our report from last year, which is the personal consumption expenditures, the producer price index, and the CPI transportation. So we were kind of poking around in some of these websites to see exactly what a potential viable alternative could be, if one even exists. And kind of what we're finding is that some of these other metrics do seem to have the ability to kind of break out by categories. So by, vehicle sales and fuel and insurance and, those types of things. If that's the route we would potentially want to go, we just have to figure out exactly how to pick and choose the right categories to consider, and then how we would then splice that into some new figure. So that's kind of one of the challenges there. Did you have any thoughts on that, Michael?
No, just was thanks for the update. Sorry I'm late. Just a question about the websites. Is there I was just hoping to get links so that I can look at the information.
Yeah, open up the chat. I posted a couple of them. I know you just joined. Maybe they're not there. If not, I can repost them. But yes, double check and see if they're there.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not seeing them in my chat.
Okay. Here, let me just repost these real quick. Okay, so there's one. And there's another one. Those were the two primary ones we were looking at. The third one, the producer price index, it wasn't very user friendly. It didn't look like, and it didn't appear to be broken out into different categories. So we focused more on the other two, which again, it's almost, they both have interactive tools where you can kind of pick and choose different categories, or at least one of them did. So, and then the other one was a little more, it was essentially just a list of the different categories that could potentially be considered. So, but yeah, there's those links.
Okay. Just a quick thought, and I realize that I may be behind the curve here. Is I'm thinking that what's appropriate would be a balance between both what both the cost to the towers and the ability of the people being towed to pay as well. So it seems like both aspects need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
You've got mail.
All right.
You've got mail.
Let's see. Does anybody else have any thoughts on this? And I mean, we can continue to look at these. Like I said, we can play around with the those online tools and kind of see, different amalgamations of the different metrics. Splice a few categories together, like in the BEA one, the personal consumption expenditure. Maybe just somehow taking the figures from, transportation, vehicle sales, fuel costs, insurance, and then kind of maybe just, Frankensteining those together to kind of create its own little number. Because a lot of these, totaled up based on everything, but we would essentially be deciding which ones to kind of pick and choose from, which in turn would kind of create its own percentage, and that would be applied as opposed to, just the flat CDOLA CPI as a potential option. So, but yeah, like I said, I backtracked through the CDOLA CPI, and that takes us to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. But I'm not seeing a lot of options to break it out into categories. So we may just be stuck with that one as an overall kind of catch-all CPI figure. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything. Yeah, I'm not seeing categories for it. So, because otherwise we could just maybe even suggest continuing to use that CPI, but only like a sub part of it, but it doesn't look like it's broken out that way, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, we can continue to discuss that. All right, let's see. So, that was the primary agenda item I had for today, was kind of have a little more in-depth discussion about those kinds of alternatives. And again, we were able to identify a couple potential tools we could use in those links there. So I think we can each kind of go in there and poke around a little bit, see if there's anything or any amalgamation of the data that we think would be better suited to that kind of a situation than what the commission's currently using. So, all right. Well, let's see if there's nothing else anybody wants to talk about on the CPI alternatives.
Well, so apologies if I'm asking for a question that will repeat some input already given. I'm curious from Mr. Connolly's side whether just the thoughts on the appropriateness of these different indices.
What are you talking about?
Well,
What do you mean
shifting from the current CPI formula that's being used to some combination of these alternative indexes.
Well, the thing is, we haven't found anything that kind of breaks everything down by category. So it was a question brought up if that was the right mechanism to be using, and that's where it kind of started the conversation.
Okay. All right. Thanks. That brings me up to speed where you are, and I'm just curious what other comments have been from other task force members.
Yeah, everyone's been pretty quiet about that, other than Nate.
Well, yeah, and I mean it's not just about. I see it as kind of a two-part question, which is, first off, is the towing task force's overall position on the fact that there is an annual inflation adjustment mechanism in place, is that in general, is that something the towing task force supports the commission doing? And if so, is the CPI through CDOLA the correct metric to use? Or is there a potential alternative that may be better? So it's really a two-part question. And I haven't heard, I feel like, since, the beginning of 2022, it doesn't seem like we've heard much from towing task force members that that's an incorrect way for the commission to be going about it. And the conversation seems to always trend more towards, well, what are they using? What is the commission using to make that adjustment? And so that's why I kind of started off on the conversation on the basis of, well, if just the flat CDOLA CPI percentage that comes out, every February, if that's not the correct metric to use or the most appropriate metric to use, then what is, or what sub part of another inflation adjustment metric is better. So that's kind of what we were exploring a little bit today, is some of these other ones that we put in our report last year on, okay, maybe these might be better, but it seems like there's not going to be anything that just comes out pre-packaged. It's not like we do now, where we just look at the CDOLA website and there's a flat percentage there and that's what we use. It's almost like if we were to use one of these other, admittedly more federal level metrics, we couldn't just use the flat metric itself. We're going to have to use subparts of it. We're essentially going to have to pick and choose which categories we pull and then splice all those together. And that's what it would be. So little more math, but again, if that's more appropriate than what the commission's currently doing, then I think the commission would be receptive to that, as long as we could kind of lay out a case for that other metric, whatever we thought was best.
Well, I think that was a two-part question. So on the first part, an annual adjustment is definitely needed. I mean, that's something that's always been the problem. That's why it went into place, because trying to go through the process of getting a rate increase took too long of a period of time to adjust. So the first part of the question is, yes, that's a great idea. The second part is more of the nuts and bolts of it. Is it the correct way to do it?
What if we kind of looked at, and I think this is something, and sorry if I put words in your mouth, Michael, but what if we go back and looking at the difference in, consensual and non-consensual tows, and you look at how the consensual tow rate has changed over time, because that would be considered then something that has changed in the marketplace, right, through a marketplace that naturally occurred. And you'd have to assume that the towing companies that do consensual tows are at a rate that's profitable, and they're negotiating with the public. And so, we could see how that changed over time comparison to these other indices, because that could potentially not just go up with inflation, but go down with, in other times where there's plenty of towers, more towers than users, right?
Yeah, that was broadly where I was headed with that suggestion, and it struck me as that may be an actual more of an accurate reflection of the cost to towers, with the recognition that consensual rates are really reflecting a subset of the cost borne by non-consensual towers. And so I think it would be appropriate really to be very careful about paying attention to the other costs involved as well. But at any rate, the suggestion was that I think that's going to be a more accurate picture of the cost to towers, and wouldn't be quite so based on averages that are affecting a whole lot of other industries. So that's one part for me, and I would agree that compensation to towers should reflect just the general economy, and so I'm broadly in support of that. The flip side on the non-consensual customer, I would like that to be addressed as well, and so that we're not simply accommodating one of the affected entities in this process. And so I still would like to have a way of decoupling what towers are compensated from what the customers are charged. I still don't like the idea that the customers are basically footing the whole bill, just because that, again, that strikes me as a cost that well exceeds the nature of the infraction, and for any comparable traffic parking related infractions, the cost to the violator is far below what they end up being charged in the towing context. So my view is in summary two parts. One, I think the towing companies should be compensated at a fair rate, and that needs to go up according to local economic factors or down. But then to the charges to the customer need to be more in line with the nature of the infraction.
So I wonder, like, if we're looking at just the cost of consensual tolls versus non-consensual tolls, for instance, right? I think in part that may consider the consumer, because if the consumer's hurting and they can't pay, then they're not going to hire the towing company. They may figure out alternatives to get their car moved because they have more time involved, right? And if the towing company's charging more than the general consumer, because the consumers of consensual tolls and non-consensual tolls kind of intersect in some aspects, right? Because it's it could be the same person that car broke down that happened to also park in somebody else's towing spot or in a fire zone or in a person with disabilities spot, and so it gets towed. So it kind of adjusts, based on market principles. And the second is, if we look at the cost difference, I mean, in the past, we relied on data from other states, but we seem like we focused on this whole universe of every cost that's involved in the tower, which is hard to wrap our heads around. So you just kind of take this arbitrary number. But if we started at the consensual tow and make the assumptions that towing companies are making profit off consensual tolls, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it, or they'd all be out of business, and then just focus on what is the differential cost between a consensual tow and a non-consensual tow. And I think, you can start throwing in that there's bigger pieces of equipment, et cetera, et cetera. But if we focused on, 90% of the tows, maybe I'm speaking out of turn because it's not my area of expertise, but just assuming it's a large percentage of the tows on the normal cars and normal tows, then what's the difference? Then you can come up with an accurate rate for those, which is the bulk of the tolls, and then you're really negotiating the heavier equipment pieces.
Well, and you're on the right path. I mean, if you look at my consensual rates versus my non-consent rates, there's a huge difference, and it goes into manpower, right? So on a consensual tow, I don't have to man 24/7. I don't have ETAs to meet. I don't have to be there at a certain time. If we were to eliminate that to where you didn't have the emergency side of things, you could drop your cost drastically just with employee costs. And employee costs are what drives it through the roof. And then your facility, right? Because the consent towing, you don't need a facility. So you don't need a facility to store cars. You don't have to have insurance to protect those cars. You don't have to have manpower at those facilities. So you could definitely set it up like that. And that's kind of how the industry automatically sets itself up. So you're definitely on the right path.
Well, I mean, then we could focus in on what's the difference between paying somebody their normal hours versus overtime hours, or somebody who would work later at night, right? What's that delta? But a lot of the costs of the insurance, the gas, the everything else is similar. On the facilities, we can get into what it costs for a facility. What's the benefit and the cost, right? Benefits to somebody who owns a facility and how those are set up. Because I'm assuming it's, how many towers own the facility versus lease it, right? Or have a separate entity or a related entity that owns it, and then they lease it. Because you may be owning it in one entity and leasing it back to a towing company in another, because you get special tax advantages that way. And so that's a benefit, and try to figure out that delta. But if you focus in on those costs, which are real difference of costs, we can see what the delta is, and then see if the movement and towing rates on consensual move, how they move with the other indicators like CPI, PPI, and see if it's, if there's a better way of doing that, because it's moving with the market that actually has costs around it directly to the market, versus a index that has costs that have no, or little relation to what we're pricing in here. I mean, we look at the CPI and people tell you that, the cost of living they get in the CPI on their Social Security is completely different than what they're experiencing going to the store, right? And what they have to buy.
Yep.
All right. good conversation. And I know some of it is stuff we were talking about last year, but it's good to hear some of these points get raised again.
Yeah, I just think that we're just narrowed down the data points that we're really focused on, because we can cover a number of them with the consensual tolls. And then you look at that, what's the outlier, what's the delta, as opposed to before, I think we always tried to attack what are the total costs. And so that became an astronomical exercise. And so this would just narrow it down. Just my
Right.
thought.
So now we get into the situation that Michael's talking about. So we do the math and we figure out we're pretty much right where we need to be currently. And then we have this problem of the violation doesn't justify the cost, right? So how do we adjust that cost? And if that's the cost of the tower and the tower needs to be compensated, okay. So I mean, let's just use round numbers. If it costs $200 to the tower, but we don't want to charge the consumer $200, what do we want to charge the consumer? And then who pays the difference? Right? I mean, that's where the discussion goes at that point. So what's got anybody ideas? Michael, you got any ideas on where do we recoup the other part of the money? Does that come from the property owner?
Well, as a starting place, yes. So, as a quick reminder of where I'm coming from, I'm both representing my background is that I'm representing manufactured homeowners who are residing in parks, but I'm also just personally head of a co-op, and so I both want to protect residents and also want to be doing some towing for the sake of our co-op. So with that background in mind, I am playing around with the idea, just as a starting point, perhaps an endpoint, of having something like a fee charged to the customer that is largely in line with what fees are for parking offenses, doing law enforcement tows, and charging those to the person who is towed, and then having the landlord cover the difference. And so that's basically the idea. And then structuring the landlord side would be basically that there's a contract arrangement that already has to be in place with towers, because you need to have the signs up indicating who the towing company is, and so where people whose cars are towed need to go in order to find their cars. So it's starting to set up potentially a contract relationship where I'm assuming the towing company would want some kind of an annual fee from the landlord in order to provide the towing services, and then that could be supplemented by a per tow kind of rate. So that's how I'm just imagining how it might go in the other direction. And also taking on some of John's comments, it's similar to how you might pay for snow removal service. You're setting up a contract. You want the people to be available to do the work when you need them, and you need to reflect a per visit.
Well, I mean, I think that's definitely, viable. I think one of the challenges, or what it does, right, is like when John said, well, there's a cost to tow. And so if you don't hit what their costs are, they're not going to tow or provide that service, right? And so by saying, okay, well, we want the landlord to pay a piece of it. So you're taking that piece and instead of having the violator pay it, you're actually putting it into the cost of housing in general, because that gets spread over just like tow removal. So everybody's rent goes up to compensate the cost of the violators at that point. And so you're taking the towing costs and putting it into housing costs, which I would arguably be that, down at the state capitol, everybody's up in arms over what it costs for housing right now. And so that's what becomes a challenge. And so you're increasing everybody's, housing rates for the cost of people who are breaking rules. And so that's what the challenge would be, and how that gets done and how it gets spread out over time is, those costs get put in there. The rents are really driven by market forces, but nobody's going to build an apartment unless they hit a minimum return threshold. So they don't build it until the rents rise enough to cover all those costs that get put into the housing, whether it's a towing, whether it's a snow removal, whether it's a regulation by the state. And so, there's a shortage of housing until the rents go up enough that it makes sense for developers to build. So, I mean, you're still, in my opinion, it's a good thought, but you're just moving the cost from one party onto another party.
I agree with that.
Yeah, agreed too. If I can respond, just from my
Yeah,
vantage point as coming at this from a co-op version of landlords, which is that I get the impression from my community that our residents would be for this kind of a solution, in part just because they want the towing to occur. And I think they will recognize also that the community as a whole will have to pay for the contract as part of their rent. But then that has, at least within a co-op situation, it has a kind of a natural disciplining effect, so that the actual parking rules for which towing is used as an enforcement mechanism will vary based upon how much people value the enforcement of the parking rules, because they recognize that there will be a cost to enforcing it. And so at least in the co-op context, we've got a feedback mechanism where both sides are actually reflected, right? People want to have parking regulations enforced on the one hand, and then on the other hand, they recognize that
Is that that's freezing up, or is it Michael?
No, I think it's Michael.
I think it's Michael.
Okay, because mine's been freezing up all day, so I didn't know.
Yeah, I think it's Michael. We'll wait for him to come back. I get where he's coming from, though. Because people, I do think, in general, communities do value, parking policies, as long as they're not too nitpicky. I think, community members do value the fact that there are parking policies in place and they are enforced, so that, it's not just kind of a Wild West free for all at your community, where, maybe the parking space that you lease every month is actually open for you to park in all the time. Like, that's, people want that. But at the same time, I think they just, I'm sure he'll come back. At the same time, I think people also, I guess, ideally could, improve those relations between the tenants and the property owners, to make sure that those parking policies that have been adopted, that have been put in place, are not too extreme, and are not, too burdensome on the tenants to adhere to. So it's a balancing act, and every community is different.
Totally a balancing act. And I will say that, the property owners, at least in apartment buildings, which, that's where my expertise lies. Like, we don't generate any dollars from a tow. Like the only thing we get is an angry resident, right? So it's not, there's no incentive for us to have tight parking policies to tow because we don't generate revenue from that. We don't have any revenue sharing from the towing companies on those contracts. And so, and I would say a lot of the tows come, from like fire lane violations, which we're required to keep those open because it's a life safety issue. And then the others is for people that are actually paying for a spot. And then the people with disabilities, they have a spot that they don't pay for, but they have, right? And so if somebody's paying for a spot, but I'll say even more, most of those, like somebody has to be parked there for a long time because somebody has to call a towing company. They have to be able to dispatch somebody else. And a lot of times before they even come out, the car is moved. So just from a incentive standpoint, the property owner is not incentivized to tow it just to be like a big bad landlord. And I'm enforcing policies because I can, because it just gets us an upset resident. And if we don't tow, we have an upset resident and whoever spot they're parking and paying for it.
Yeah, no, and I respect that, Mr. Rich. I do. At least I'd like to think that, the vast majority of property owners, they're not out to get people. They're not, here to make things, their parking policies overly burdensome for people to comply with. It's more of a, these are the minimum standards that our community needs to survive, our parking situation. And so at least that's how I like to look at it. But yeah, I agree with your points. Jim, did you want to jump in?
Hey, John, is there some history behind contracts and property owners and towing? I mean, I'm thinking there used to be years ago.
What do you mean history? I mean, that's pretty common to have a contract between the tower and the property owner.
Currently, right now, there is.
Yes.
But wasn't there some issues in the past? I mean, I turn to you for history on
Well,
this.
there's been some that are pretty, they got pretty tight where they were towing for expired license plates. And that didn't stem from the apartment complex and it didn't stem from the towers. It stemmed from the cities. So you had city ordinances where it said you can't have a vehicle parked on your property with expired tags unless it was behind a fenced area. So then the apartment complexes were getting hit with city codes or whatever they call them. And so then they started putting that in their rules. And then when you get down into some of the higher ups, Cherry Creek areas, things like that, I seen contracts that said tow the car if it had a flat tire, tow it if it looked disabled, tow it if it looked dirty, like it wasn't being used, and they didn't want ugly cars sitting around. So it was pretty much just tow ugly cars. And they kind of just washed their hands of it and just handed it to a tow company and say, here, deal with this and make the place look good. And I think that's kind of the threshold of where it all went downhill. So, but going back, talking about the payment and stuff, like right now, the legislators put that $40 provision. That doesn't work for the towing industry. Everybody that's taken that provision of $40, nobody's paid it back. So you're getting to the point where the towers are not going to do that when they're only getting $40 or $60 or, they're 15% of whatever it is. I don't know if I know of one tower that said he had to kind of pay him back out of the entire state. So there's definitely got to be a change somehow. I mean, I'm not opposed to the original way of that towing, as looking at it from a tower. I understand the apartment complexes and the property owners' position. They gotta be able to clear the spots for the fire lanes, the handicap, and anybody that's paying for permits. And I get it; it's a necessity that they need. The problem is towing is so expensive that's going to be a high price for a violator. What I don't agree on is how it's being implemented. I think it should be more of the property implementing the tows, not the tow carriers. And I think it needs to be laxed a little bit. Right now it's just too instantaneously. Someone's unloading their groceries out of their car and it gets nailed out of the fire lane before they have a chance to even empty the groceries. And to me, that's not a life-threatening situation. If the building's not on fire, they can't use the fire lane for 5 minutes to unload groceries. That's a moral compass issue, right? And so how do you get that into the equation? And how do we as a task force put something forward that somehow can help fix that equation?
So going back to Brandon's discussion, and I thought it was interesting, and this may in part be what Jim was getting to a moment ago, talking about the older contracts, but it sounds like a potential train of thought could be, some new rate system where you essentially have the costs being a little more spread around, where you essentially would have kind of and I don't even know how this would work, if it would be some kind of almost like a monthly or maybe an annual vendor fee that the towing carrier charges to perform services at a particular private property. The tow occurs and somehow that amount is in some proportion split up between the property owner and the vehicle owner. In what proportions, I don't know. And of course, if there's some type of an annual vendor fee being charged to the property anyway, that potentially could offset some of the overall fees for the services as well. But yeah, John, do you know if there's ever been, because I don't really know too much in regards to what the contracts between a towing carrier and a private property looked like prior to 2009, 2010, when the commission allowed the towing carriers to essentially start acting as the authorized agents. I'm not sure if there was any kind of, vendor style fees, like same for snow removal, for example. I don't know if that was ever being charged as part of those contracts. I've never seen one. So
So in the old contracts, we used to charge the property owners, and I'm going back into the 80s. So if you go back into early 80s into the 90s, we used to charge the property owners, and I want to say in the 90s it was like $150, and that's what we charged the property owner to remove the vehicle. And then if the consumer picked up the vehicle, the consumer paid the fees, and then we reimbursed the property owner, or we kept it on file for their next tow, however they wanted to do it. Some just had 150 already in the bank, ready to go. But there was no annual, because it's hard to do an annual if you don't know what you're doing. So like on some law enforcement, so I have some law enforcement contracts that I've towed for, decades. So I know their percentages, and I can say, okay, your annual fee is going to be X amount, because I know you're going to tow somewhere between, 200 and 250 this year. So if I know that's how many they're going to do in a year, I can kind of put an annual budget together. But in the private property world, you really don't know how many violators you're going to get in a year, and unless you have a lot of history with them that you can, have the data to look back on and say, they average X amount of tows per year. So that's kind of how the old school was. The property owner flipped the bill up front, and then if they picked it up, the consumer paid for it. And then there were times where it was blatant that no one was going to pick it up. It was like a tenant that got evicted. They left an old Chevy there that they were rebuilding in the parking lot, and it was there for 7-8 months, and they knew no one was coming to get it. They ended up just paying the bill to have it hauled off.
So, and I think where some of the abuses come in on the fire lanes what John was talking about is because the properties don't have, somebody going out and monitoring the parking lots. They just, and the tow trucks have people working them because they have to do the non-consensual tows. So we would leave it to the towing company to monitor the parking lots. So you'd get a zealous driver that drives around and just picks it up. The ones where he's talking about that, hey, your car should be pretty, or, those, I believe we have to tag them for a certain time period. There's a time period that they're tagged before they can be towed. So it's not an instantaneous tow of, hey, somebody has a flat tire, their car is getting towed. That, you have to tag it and give them a chance. I think there's two challenges, with in the same with the license plate. It's not just it had to do with inoperable cars because there's limited parking. If you go to any website on the property, especially if it's by a TOD site, the parkings are tight there. And so, residents you go look at their website and their reviews. The biggest complaint by residents typically on those properties are there's not enough parking. And there's no parking. So if you have somebody who has an inoperable car and is just storing it on the parking lot, that's where, it becomes an issue to the rest of the residents. But even then, those have to be tagged for a period of time before they can be towed. So somebody can come out and see, that they've been tagged and they have time to move it and take it off. So they don't have to be towed. They can just move it on their own. But that's a challenge. I think they changed it where we can't give that authorization. So we have to have another third party that can authorize each tow now.
No, not entirely. It actually is more geared towards the property owners themselves. And that's, I think, historically kind of what it's been like, in the past, where it was mostly the property owners authorizing the tows, but that was never going to last forever. It's, most property owners don't want to come down to, the parking lot at 3 a.m. to sign for a tow. That's just, they'd rather outsource that. And so that's when those third parties came along, where, you had essentially these parking management third party companies coming in and essentially being delegated that authority by the property owner so that they can have this other company or person perform those authorizations as opposed to them doing it themselves. And that's always been fine and something the commission has been comfortable with. But yeah, based on the recent changes to the statutes, it's a little more geared towards the property owners and their agents being involved and kind of taking the towing carriers out of that decision, and at least as it pertains to residential style private property impounds.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that legislation last year did give some additional latitude, especially with residential tows, where that 24-hour notice is the thing now, and it's something, at the commission we're definitely checking for that, and we do see some violations sometimes that we need to address. But that's the new standard, and that's how we explain it to people. And there's exemptions to that. So, like parking in front of a fire lane, you don't have to wait 24 hours for that. Blocking somebody else's space, you don't have to wait 24 hours for that. Parking in a handicap space when you're not supposed to be there, you don't have to wait 24 hours for that. So, there are exemptions that were cut out of that. But when you're talking about, the flat tire or, parking across two spaces, maybe not intentionally, you're just kind of bleeding into that other space. Those are instances that would require the 24-hour notice, and that's how we advise people to do it. So it does give a little more latitude to the tenants, hopefully without giving too much of an additional burden on the property owners.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Okay.
I don't think hopefully I'm not trying to relay that it's giving a burden. I'm just saying that there's those stuffs that are in place to make sure that they're not overzealous, because it was, the reason you contracted with a towing company again is you're always trying to reduce costs, because those costs are burdened by the residents ultimately, right? And so when you have somebody, if you have to man your property 24 hours, that just kind of goes into housing costs. And so so the challenge would be is you have overzealous people. But I'll tell you that, there's multiple times, part of the good news of the contract is we do have leverage with the tower because we're in a contract with them. And so, we ask all the time for them if there's a question to return vehicles at no cost, right? Like they come in, they say, hey, here's what happened. And you're like, okay, will you just return it?
Yeah, and I've seen so many instances like that over the years where that's exactly what happens. You know, maybe it is a situation where the tenant was in the wrong and they were towed in accordance with the contract, but because of some mitigating circumstance, the property owners are like, "Can you just release it at no charge, please?" And then the towing carriers, way more often than not, are all too eager to comply because they want to continue that business relationship. So,
Yeah.
and that's how I've always described it to people, is that, you know, the property owners really do hold all of the cards in this kind of a scenario. So, authorize, basically making a decision on when tows are going to be authorized to be towed away, under what circumstances, all of that. You have to, of course, splice in some of the new criteria under the new statutes from last year. But I mean, for the most part, it is still completely up to the property owners, under what circumstances a tow occurs, what kind of warnings are given, for how long, all of that is determined by the property owners. They're the ones who make that decision, nobody else. So yeah. And again, when it comes to the continued business, I mean, that's part of what keeps the towing carriers in line, not just the PUC, but also, the property owners. If they hire a towing carrier and they are enforcing the terms of that contract in a way that's overzealous, the property owner is going to relay that to the towing carriers and say, "Hey, our tenants aren't happy about how you're managing this contract, so we need you to tone it down a bit." And if they don't, then they're at risk of losing that contract and the property owner going to somebody else. And I've heard of that happening on numerous occasions.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of times that, they get returned that never rises to your level, right? But that's not to say that there's not bad actors on the property side. There's not bad actors on the towing side, but even making the regulation, there's still bad actors. People just break the rules, right? Just like the people violate the towing. There's people that, the towing, not ordinances or regulations, and there's people that violate the laws every day. Not just in property, but that's just part of reality.
Yeah. Well,
I
and
think the other problem is the incentives that towers give to their drivers, right? I mean, that plays a large part into those overzealous tow operators. I know some tow companies will give their drivers $75 for every car they bring in, right? Well, I mean, in today's world, I mean, look how expensive everything is. It doesn't take much to find somebody in a hurt lock that will then become overzealous real easy when you look at it like that. And if they can take a car every hour, that's $75 an hour. And if they're local and they're not being checked on their DOT rules and things like that, well, they can run over 10 hours.
Is there a way to like adjust that and take that incentive away? Because like you're saying, Nate, right now, the real governor is that we get residents come in and they're complaining, and it doesn't benefit us to have angry. It doesn't benefit us to have somebody who's taking their groceries and they parked in the fire lane and their car gets towed because, in essence, they're mad at their landlord for that as well, not the towing company, because we're the property owner. And so a lot of times we call the towing company and say, "Hey, will you return the car?" And like you say, they typically do, but I'm sure there's a lot of people that don't, that don't have that leverage like that. And so I don't know, maybe it's a way the towing industry is compensating some of those enforcements that could resolve the issue.
Right. And it's a slippery slope, because I mean, how do you tell a company how they can pay? And really they're doing it to incentive, get incentives for their employees to work. I mean, I don't know how many you have employees, but trying to get them to work that's a feat in itself. So you have to give them something to get them motivated. And unfortunately, about the only thing that motivates an employee is money.
Yeah, I agree with John. That might be a tricky, road to go down, just because, like he said, it's, what authority does the towing task force have to recommend, or even the commission to implement some type of guardrails on how their business model works in regards to compensating employees or even independent contractors? There's a lot of the industries that the PUC regulates do operate in kind of an independent contractor basis. So you see it with taxi cab companies, you see it with limousine companies, you see it with shuttle companies, you see it with a lot of different carrier types that we regulate. And while we're aware of it, there's not really a whole lot we do there's not really a lot of regulations or anything we impose on that kind of a compensation structure. We just don't. And so
I'm not for regulation, but I will say that, I mean, our we're regulated, most industries, on how they pay, who can be salaried versus hourly, overtime rules. There's commission rule, the Department of Real Estate, on when commissions can be paid, who they can be paid to. So I mean, there is some, I think, room in there, but I don't know that it's the right thing to do. So please, I'm not advocating, but that's maybe, if that's the root of like a big amount of these complaints, maybe we look at it and it's kind of like the CPI, PPI. Maybe we look at it and say, wow, it's not perfect by any stretch, but it's better than nothing. And there's nothing that's perfect. And maybe we look at the compensation and go, well, if you change it, it'll improve it. But maybe you're like, but there's going to be more unintended consequences. And maybe, it's not the best, but we don't see anything better, right? I mean, I'm just trying to look outside the box and say, how do we come up with something that is palatable to everybody?
all right.
I mean, the good news is, I will tell you this, that the industry in a whole, for a lot of these incidents, are moving towards different, like, kind of having car boots as opposed to the tows, which are extraordinarily less if we can do it in a situation where the car doesn't have to move quickly, right? It's a violation, you just get it booted, and then it only costs, a fraction of the cost, whether it's $50 or $75, as opposed to a few $100. So
yeah, there's not a lot of, because we regulate booting companies too. That was a new regulated industry that we started having oversight over back in, I want to say it was 2019. So we've been regulating it for a little less than 5 years now. But yeah, there's not a lot of licensed booting companies that operate. So there's been a few occasions where you have kind of a quasi joint operation between a booting company and a towing company, where essentially the booting company comes in first, boots the vehicle, and then after a certain amount of time, maybe it's 24, 48 hours, then the towing company comes in and tows it. Mm-hmm. So, and it seems like that's a style of operation that could be better implemented and could potentially work to a greater extent, where you're not seeing as much burden placed on the vehicle owners and the property owners too. I haven't seen it implemented quite in a more larger scale way to know if that's an effective way to go about it. It's kind of a small sample size that we've drawn conclusions from. So
well, it's new, so we'll have to see how it works out.
Right. All right, Jeff, you've been pretty quiet. Any thoughts on any of this?
I think Jeff's sleeping.
Yeah, that's no problem. Okay. Well, I think this has been a good discussion. I think we've hit some good points. And I do think it's interesting, the concept of bringing property owners potentially a little more back to the table by, in some way, potentially allowing them to be somewhat financially responsible for the towing services that occur on their property. I know we've had similar conversations in the past with certain properties who need to have vehicles relocated on the property because of things like resurfacing and power washing and things like that. And I think we've at times seen that done successfully, as long as the vehicle owner isn't being charged. But it's definitely an interesting concept, and I think would have an impact potentially on what the commission might set as its maximum rates. Just factoring in things like, I don't know. I would imagine that towing carriers would potentially be a lot more comfortable with the property owner being responsible for some of those fees as opposed to the vehicle owners, because I would imagine it would be kind of a greater assurance that that money would actually be paid. Is kind of how I look at it. But just, I mean, because I would imagine somebody, especially if we're talking about an abandoned motor vehicle, you know, given the fact that that tow would have been performed under a contract where the property owner to some extent would be obligated to pay the fees, that's the towing carrier is likely to get a payment out of the property owner versus the vehicle owner or even a subsequent sale of the vehicle. So that's kind of one of my thoughts on that topic. But
I agree. I mean, I think what you bring out of the system is the bad debt that he's talking about, the non-payment.
right.
But what you do is you insure it with every other resident, you know, compensating for it, because that's really where it goes into.
But I don't disagree, Brandon, that I do think in turn would result even indirectly in potentially housing increases, because again, if it would be just the same as if, you know, any other vendor contract went up, you know, that in turn then affects rental prices and HOA fees and things like that. That's just the nature of when prices go up, then, you know, the cost of rent or an HOA fee is just in turn going to go up. That's just kind of how it works. To what extent, hard to say. But, you know, for something where the property owner potentially would be responsible for some or even all of the fees associated with a non-consensual tow that's being performed from their property, again, it's hard to say what kind of an impact that would have, but I would imagine it would be something.
Right.
So.
Well, and I was just thinking back, when we were charging $150 to the property owner, in today's world, that's peanuts. Back then, our tow trucks were costing around $35,000. And in contrast, today that same tow truck's $150,000. You know, labor rates back then were you know, $5-6 an hour. You know, the car, when you haul it to the scrap, you got $35 a ton. Right. So it's a different time. So if you start adding what it was then to where it is now, you're probably looking, that would be, you know, $500 to process a vehicle now, you know. So, I mean, when property owners are looking at that and going, okay, if you had to pay $500 for every car you had removed, that's definitely going to affect housing. Definitely. Especially if they tow 200 cars a month. You know, if they do 200 cars a year, that's going to be less. But if it's a high profile property, or they're towing 200 a month, that could be a huge impact on that.
Yeah, I don't think we have any you know, properties. We have some properties over 1,000 units, and I would, none of them do close to that volume on a tow basis. You know, I mean, if they did 10 out of the one that has 1,000, I'd be surprised. But
Right.
you know, I don't know. I'm just asking you because rent costs are so high right now, and you know, you see a whole bunch of cranes because of it in the sky. But what I'll tell you is there's 40,000 units being built, which the benefit of that is rents are coming down now. If you look at it, rents are actually dropping. But because the interest rates went up and people are having a harder time pay it, like if you look at what's going to happen past all these 40,000 units, there's nobody building. It has completely stopped. And so in 2027, like you're going to see rates starting to shoot up again because it takes people 2 to 3 years to get an apartment built.
Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, John, I know you don't really do much PPI anymore, but what percentage of vehicles that were towed in that way do you think were collected in like the first 48 hours?
I did about 330 private properties in my business, but I didn't monitor. I did call only. The property owners had to call me. And I would say that 90% of them didn't get picked up at all.
Okay.
But I was more of I didn't charge max rates. I pretty much charged around a consensual rate. because I only did it Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, and it was pretty much getting stuff that was just abandoned junk on their properties, just helping them clean it up. Because I don't believe in monitoring. That's me personally. So my company doesn't do that.
Okay.
And then after the new rules with all the requirements and signage and stuff, I have a pretty fancy lobby, and I don't have enough room on the walls to put all the signage they want up. So just trying to comply with all that, I just couldn't do it.
You know, I know he's not on our task force, but I mean, if you just want that data, I think they would provide it, and Trevor and them would have that. I'm pretty sure, you know, because they do our properties, and we have almost 50,000 units across the Front Range.
Well, and the reason I bring it up is because I just was curious if this is, you know, an area or a concept that's going to be explored where we're potentially, you know, going to try to figure out some kind of a strategy whereby the property owners are somehow going to be on the hook for some of the fees associated with these kinds of tows. It's like, to what extent, you know, at what point, basically, how is it all parsed out? You know, what is the property owner responsible for? What's the vehicle owner responsible for? Because you also got to consider things like, you know, what's the disincentive for people to park appropriately if they don't have to pay anything? So, you know, things like that. So it's just, these are the kind of thoughts that are swirling around in my head with these kind of topics.
Right. And that's the issue we have with the $60.
Right.
You know, the $60, and that gets out there, and then now everyone's doing it. And it was, you know, it's different. I look at it differently. If there's someone in need and someone's struggling and can't afford that, then yeah, you know, you cut them every break you can. But you know, when you see a lawyer that charges $500 an hour and he parks illegally and then tries to claim the $60, and you know he's got plenty of money because you know you towed in his Mercedes.
Well, those are guys that know the law the most, so they're the ones
Right.
going to take advantage of it.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, maybe part of that is, you know, in making a recommendation to adjusting it, and you know, having to show some financial need or something like that would cut that down some. You know, before they could, and so it's not just across the board of, hey, you know, 40, and maybe it's the 40 is not the right number.
Well, but I assume you know, the towing industry just in general would be a lot more receptive to the whole $60, you know, 15% provision if the property owner was on the hook for whatever the remainder of the balance was on top of that. But that's not that's not how it's currently set up. So that's a non-issue.
But I mean, the question would be, as a renter, would like, and you park and you adhere to all the laws, would you be happy paying for the violators that are the ones breaking it?
Exactly.
Well, and that's kind of the problem with our society currently. I mean, all these laws and rules that we're currently dealing with were based on a society that was responsible for their own actions. And now we have a society that is not responsible for their own actions. You know, I mean, you look at car theft. I'm a huge law enforcement tower. I tow multiple stolen vehicles a day that the police recover, and the judges let them go. I mean, as long as they haven't had over 4, you know, stolen vehicles on their record, they let them out of jail. So if they've only stole 2, they can still, you know, steal another one before they have to worry about jail time. So there's no incentive to stop people from stealing the cars to begin with. So you're not going to stop violators if there's no punishment.
Yeah, and the property owners, you might not have a tow for a long time, but you're not going to know how many cars you're going to tow. We're not going to know how many violators there are. So you're just going to come up with the fee. So basically, you know, the I don't know what the actual number of units across the metro, but it's probably somewhere around 500,000 units. So you're basically, you know, charging 500,000 residents for however many violations there are. So that way you can soften the blow on them. And so that, you know, becomes a little bit of a moral dilemma in my mind of like, you know, when rents are so high, even if you're only adding a couple bucks a month, it's still, Like,
Right.
why am I paying? Because I park in my spot every single time.
Right.
Yeah, it's a catch-22 in the world that we're in right now.
Jim, did you want to jump in?
No, I'm okay. I was, but I'm okay. They were saying the things, so. And I just, I have a problem, you know, I guess my opinion is causing, you know, additional housing costs to people. It just doesn't, because I'm actually seeing the, you know, property insurance right now is going up 20-30% a year again. I mean, we already got stuff pushing this housing market, you know, and now we're talking about possibly pushing something up because it is going to, I mean, anything we add to the cost of doing business for these property owners is going to get, it has to be reflected into the rent, or, you know, so, you know, I don't know if that's solving any issues at all. I think that would be an uphill battle. Just,
I
You
think
know, but-
limiting. Well, sorry, John. James. I didn't mean to cut you off.
that's okay. Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think when you limit the scope, right, and because like when you say, okay, well, you have to have 24 hours on these cars and you're giving them time before they can get towed, or you limit and saying, hey, we're not going to tow these anymore. It may create some inconveniences, but at least we're not obligated to tow, or we can't tow. And so then that brings a little bit of relief if you're saying, hey, let's give a little bit of time so that way, you know, like when you have protections in there on the towing, I think that helps. I think that helps, or protections on if something was inaccurately towed, that disincentivized the towers to go out there and do that. So if somebody, like John said, is getting paid $75 for bringing a car in, but if they have to pick up and give that car back plus pay some money back because they were too aggressive in the tow, then I'm sure John wouldn't pay him of saying, hey, but if you bring in a car, I'll pay you 75, but if it's in violation and we got to pay out, I'm not paying you anything. You know, that may be something that helps on that.
Well, and like you had stated earlier, I mean, a lot of this, is the property owners, because if you get a call from one of your property managers and says, hey, here's the situation, they got towed, you call the tow company, they return it at no cost. Right. So I mean, my one thing about the 24-hour deal, and I'm not sure when's the last time any of you drove through some of these communities. I'm sure you have, but a lot of there's not any spaces for the tenants. I mean, you're going through there, and I mean, one car out of place, and all I have is a pickup, and I'm thinking, an EMT vehicle, they're not getting through here. I mean, I'm sitting there pulling in my mirrors and inching through some of these communities. And so, I also think about the safety and the livability for the tenants too, and some of this 24-hour stuff. I mean, I understand where it came from and why it did, but at the same time, some of it, are we going to have to go, John was talking earlier about the city ordinances on the license plates and stuff. And I mean, and I kind of remember this a little bit. Some of these property owners were getting, violations and fines from the cities because of the plate issues in the vehicles. So do we have to go back to the cities and say, hey, you got this ordinance, you need to take it off?
Yeah.
I mean, is that, if we're going to go down this road, where else do we need to go, on that?
I mean, have you had, I don't think we've had a lot of complaints or tows because of that. I haven't seen a lot bubble up. Have you?
On the license plates?
On license plates?
Yeah, it's
Not
a
since
little
COVID.
bit. Go ahead. Nate, you would know better than me.
Yeah, not
Not
since
it's
COVID.
so we actually put a rule in place even before 2020. It was it used to be Rule 6508C, I think. We're updating it just based on the legislation from last year in a way that I think is a little clearer than our rule was prior to that. But I've heard about it a little bit, but not commensurate with the hot button issue it appears to be in other areas, like just people talking about it. It is at least at some level perceived as a huge issue. I haven't personally seen it, but with the amount of people that are talking about it, I mean, it's probably just going on a little more beyond what I'm observing. But yeah, I'd say I do get calls on it though, and I explain exactly what the new statute does, which again is now relegated exclusively to residential style tows. So if somebody wants to tow a vehicle for that reason from a residential private property tow, they can't unless they have law enforcement authorization. That's the new standard. So that's how it's enforced. That's how we explain it to people. And I mean, I do get calls about it, but really it doesn't appear to be something people are calling about a lot, is what I would say.
Yeah, I would assume it, because I would think that we would have a hard time getting a police officer to come out these days for a tag that's expired. And so if we can't tow it, and I would just say that I've not heard of any of our properties getting a violation notice or fined right now from the cities at this point either. So
Right.
They've lashed up quite a bit on that rule through the cities.
Well, and I guess, you know, the way we kind of look at it is that, you know, having a valid registration / license plate, that's in order to drive it out on the roads. If it's just sitting parked at a private property, I mean, I guess I see why people get worked up about it, because it's like, I'm not even out driving it around. Like if law enforcement isn't going to come onto the property and cite me for having an expired plate or an expired registration, you know, why does the property care? You know, that's I've heard that argument before, and I guess I understand it to a certain extent.
yeah, me too. I think the only challenge is what Howes was talking about, is just as if you have too many people storing their vehicle there, you know, then it inhibits anybody else from parking there. And it's like, it's not a storage lot, but I agree with you. I mean, it's not a high priority toll for us. I mean, none of them are, if we don't have to, if it's not upsetting our residents or causing health and safety. It shouldn't be, because it doesn't generate money for us.
Well, and like Jim said, you know, it's, you know, if you drive around, and I've gone to plenty of private properties over the years myself, you know, sometimes on a personal basis, sometimes on a professional basis. And yeah, I mean, there's not a lot of wiggle room. There may be 5 visitor spots in a, you know, 50+ space lot. And if you don't live there, it's hard to find a vacancy. You know, I've had instances where I had to park out on the public street because there wasn't a spot I was comfortable parking inside the residential private property. Now, of course, I'm a lot more careful about where I park than other people probably, but I think it's kind of a double-edged sword. It just kind of reinforces that, you know, there are certain parking policies at these type of residences that need to be enforced, because otherwise the people who actually pay to live there have nowhere to park, and that's not fair either. So it is a double-edged sword, is how I've looked at it.
Well, we talked a lot about the problems of the world. We just haven't been able to solve them.
Yes, it's a continuing and evolving conversation. That's true. Let's see. Jeff, anything to add? If you want. All right. Well, I think this has been a good conversation. You know, it's if things evolve into, you know, bringing property owners back to the table in potential sharing of costs associated with, especially non-consensual tows, that's, I mean, it's a conversation that will be interesting moving forward. I think everybody's probably heard it's probably a foregone conclusion that they may be running additional tow legislation early next year. So we'll kind of wait and see what happens. But yeah, I would. Well, we'll wait and see what happens. And there may be some of us who are able to be involved in that to a certain extent, but we'll kind of wait and see if it has anything to do with rates. I do think that involves us in our mandate by statute, so I think we can discuss that kind of stuff. I know we kind of stayed out of that, the big bill from 2022, but that not a lot of that addressed rates. So I think that's why we kind of mostly stayed out of it. But if there's something coming up maybe next year that's gonna have some type of a spin on the current rate structure, especially for non-consensual tows, I think we can then be potentially a little more involved. But we'll wait and see to what amount that is appropriate. That's something we can run by John Roberts maybe during the next meeting.
Well, and that's kind of why I pitched that bill. I mean, and I know I pitched it pretty broad and basically said, let the property owners pay for it across the board. And my thought process behind it is twofold. And one of it is rates. One of it is to understand and let legislation know that you're regulating the towers out of any kind of anything. The towers are 80% of the towers in the state are ready to just say the hell with it and not even do it. And so that's going to create a huge problem with communities, trying to get parking spaces and things like that. So, just saying, nope, the property owners need to pay for it, right? And then what that does is that brings the property owners to the table. And I'm a firm believer in that. It needs to be, if you did that, you wouldn't see those towers charging the max rate, because then free enterprise would take over there. And, I look at it from a lot of tow companies, and I've asked many tow companies over the years, why are you charging the max rate? And when I was towing private properties from residents, I was charging my consent rate, but I also wasn't doing it 24/7 for them as well. So here again, my costs are down doing that. So my thought process behind this is maybe this can help twofold in the price problem as well. If they're towing off the private properties for consent rates versus the max rates, that right there is an incentive enough. That's something that it can almost go to the old school at that point, where you could say to the property owner, I'm going to negotiate the rate with you. And if the consumer pays the tow fee, then I'll reimburse you. But if they don't, you pay it, or, something like that could definitely drop the price to something more on the line of the consent area instead of the max. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would for, like us that have negotiating power, but the small mom and pops would be the ones that, and their tenants would be the ones that get, jacked, because they wouldn't have much negotiating power for the with the towing company, right? If you only have a couple units, you're only going to tow a couple times, but next time you're going to raise the rent to compensate for that, and it's going to be a high cost of the tow. It'll be a match. So I wonder why, if they just charging it and we can negotiate it down anyway, then that maximum tow rate is probably too high. But, I don't know. I mean, I guess the other part would be is we could go back and look for the smaller people and say, look, if you're saying 90% of the people don't pay, if the property owner pays it, that's a big line item cost for you. So that cost goes away. So the max tow rate should have to come down, because now you're getting paid for sure. The challenge is then how, if you pay 100%, then you lose the incentive for the bad actors. So the number of tows can go up drastically, because there's no disincentive to park in somebody else's spot other than a small inconvenience to go pick up your car.
Right.
And, so everybody does it. And now now the towing companies are making it out pretty good, hand over fist, because they're profitable and they've never towed as many cars in their entire career. And all the residents are upset because everybody's violating towing policies.
All right.
So
Let's see,
they're
on
trying to
the
balance.
towing side, if I could say that every single car that I towed in, I would get paid on, I could definitely drop my rates, because it's just like with property, right? I got to make up my loss somehow. So my
Mhm.
loss is made up from the people who pay.
Well, you'd have a double edged, I mean, you'd have it like a double incentive to drop your rate, because you'd not only be, getting paid on every vehicle, but the number would probably be twice as many, because you have twice as many violators now,
Right.
because they don't have to pay. They just, go pick up their car.
Yeah. That's why it's kind of hard to do that. I mean, it's not going to make anybody accountable. And that was my second fold of doing that, is to let these legislators and people dissect this and look at, okay, that sounds great on the surface, but is it really what needs to be done? And it's to get everybody's brain working to say, this is great in a perfect world, but this is not a perfect world. And the violators have got to be accountable, and you can't just throw it all on the tower. It can't always just be the tower. I mean, we're the service provider to help cure the problem. And that's been the hugest obstacle, is trying to get people to understand that it's not the towers trying to be the bad people. We're trying to help, right? So, but here again, if you legislate so hard and the towers are losing so much money on one end, then they have to pick it up on the other end somehow to cover their costs. And all that does is just moves it around to people who are not responsible, are the ones paying.
I mean, I understand that. That's why, like in the last go around when we're setting rates, I was just quiet most of the time until we got down to the nitty gritty of trying to figure out what it's going to be. And it felt more like an arbitrator, because, on one hand, I got to protect our residents, because they get upset if it's too high. But on the other hand, we need the service, so we don't want to put towers out of business. So, I mean, I was trying to be kind of an objective, neutral party of like, how do you get to a spot where, either everybody's happy or everybody's unhappy, and, but there's still, everybody survives.
That's Nate's problem. He has that same problem. How do you keep a healthy industry and also protect the consumers? It's a hard balance.
Yeah, no, it is. And, we do our best to kind of factor in, both sides of the equation. And, they're not always easy decisions or choices. And, sometimes the decisions that are made leave both sides somewhat unhappy, but that's the nature of regulation at times.
Yep.
All right. Well, we're coming up on time. We're about 5 minutes shy. Thanks everybody for being here. Really appreciate your participation and for the conversation. Definitely appreciate that. So let's go ahead and schedule our next meeting. We'll keep our regular schedule and plan for the second Wednesday in December. That'll be the 13th. Same time, 2 to 4. We'll go ahead and send out that invite here probably sometime before the end of the week, probably tomorrow. So just keep an eye out for that. Just another reminder on the email for the training, the cybersecurity training. And that's not just for our group, it's for all the different boards and commissions that our department oversees. So like hundreds of bodies. So yeah, it's something they want us all doing. Like I said, I already did mine. It took me like 30 minutes. It was really simple.
I have a question on that, Nate.
Yeah, sure.
So when I was trying to set up an account, it asked me for the contract start date, the duration in months, the agency, and the agency manager.
Yeah. So for the start date, I think we were using our appointment dates, which was, I believe, December 30th of 21.
Okay.
And then what were the other ones?
The duration in months.
Oh, I'm wondering if that is corresponds with our terms. Hold on. I'll tell you what yours is. Give me one sec. Here it is.
Might need
Brand-
that same info.
Yeah. So Brandon, yours is 1230 of 25.
Okay. And then it said agency or department. I don't remember what it was. And then the agency or department manager.
Yeah, it's so under department. Does it say agency or department, or do you need both?
No, I think I didn't remember if it said agency or department. I think it might have said agency.
Okay, it's if I'd probably just put Dora because that's our general department that oversees this body. So that's
Yeah,
what
it
I would
says
say.
agency. So
Yeah,
Dora.
Dora. That's I'd just say Dora. That's fine.
And then it says state agency manager.
Go ahead and just put me. That's probably the best. Because I think that's how we set it up when we set up all your emails. I was like the reporting manager, even though that's not really how it's set up, but that was just the best answer. So yeah, I think that's good. John, your term is 12/30/23.
About mine, Nate.
Jim, you are 12/30/25.
So 24 months is the contract duration.
Yeah, well, because some of when these appointments were made back on 12/30/21, some of us were appointed to 2-year terms, and some of us were appointed to 4-year terms. And so some of them were based on statute, like 2 was the max that could be done, but the remainder of them was just a governor discretionary decision.
So mine must be the 4-year from 21 to 25. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yep.
How did I get so lucky?
Right. Well, yeah, it's there's not considering the vacancies that we currently have. There's 3 members, including John and myself, that are about to term out. So I think all of us were reapplying to be reappointed, but that's
Right.
still
Well,
the governor's
thank you all for
decision.
your time and discussion today. I think it
Yes,
was
thank you.
kind of helpful for sure. We even though we were what's the guy that says everybody talks about the weather but nobody does anything about it? What's that guy?
I don't know. I don't know if I'd heard that one.
Yeah. Oh God, I forgot his name.
Pretty good though. All right. Thanks everybody. We'll go ahead and adjourn. It's 3:58 p.m. and we'll see everybody again on December 13th at 2. Thanks
All right.
everybody.
Take care.